For over a century, one military vehicle has ruled the world's battlefield, at least on the ground: the main battle tank, or MBT. Since World War I, around 160 different models of MBTs have been developed by militaries around the world, with over 140 entering active service and at least 11 next-generation models currently in development. Of course, the vast majority of those have either been destroyed in combat, particularly in World Wars I and II, or become obsolete as new technologies render their armor, firepower, and general survivability redundant. And now, the modern tank is being subjected to its toughest challenge yet. The war in Ukraine has seen more different kinds of tanks pitted against each other than any conflict since World War II, ranging from the very latest models to relics from that conflict 80 years ago. But which tanks have been the most effective, and which have turned out to be very expensive duds? So here's the breakdown of how the different MBTs in use in Ukraine have performed, and which are winning or losing the war. Now, before we dive into the different tanks that have been used by both Russia and Ukraine and how they've fared, let's take a quick look at the methodology used to assess tank performance. There's a lot more to tank effectiveness than simple statistics, like how many got hit or how thick the armor is. To get a comprehensive picture of the real value that tanks add, or don't, you need to integrate combat data with tactical context, production logistics, and technological evolution. The combat data is, of course, the most telling. Here, the most important statistics are the kill ratios, attrition rates, and mission success. In other words, the number of targets the tank successfully hit compared to the number of rounds fired, the number of losses were incurred, and the tank's contributions to successful outcomes, even if the tanks were damaged or destroyed in the process. However, the tactical context of the tank's mission profile must also be taken into account. A tank might perform superbly in one context, but be a sitting duck in others. For example, a study into the effectiveness of tanks in World War II found that a defensive German Panther was 1.1 times more effective than a British Sherman on the offensive, while a defending Sherman was 8.4 times more effective than a defending Panther. The same study found that the side that fired first also had a decisive advantage. When defenders were able to fire first, the attackers suffered 4.3 times more casualties than they did. However, when the attackers fired first, the script flipped, and the defenders suffered 3.6 times more casualties than the attackers. Tanks are also rarely used in isolation. They're typically used in conjunction with infantry traveling on foot, or in armored personnel carriers or infantry fighting vehicles, and are sometimes specifically designed for use in combination with artillery or air support. So, to accurately gauge their effectiveness, you need to take into account how well they perform their role in contributing to these combined operations. For example, if a tank is used as a battering ram to clear a path for infantry to follow behind, and is damaged but the infantry successfully lands, it's done its job, especially if it can be salvaged. As we'll see shortly, all these considerations come into play when assessing tank performance in Ukraine. Most tanks have performed pretty poorly in the offensive roles for which they were primarily built, but some have shone in specialized defensive and support roles for which they were adapted. Logistical and strategic factors like production volume, crew training, maintenance capability, fuel and spare availability, and integration into broader doctrine also play an important role in assessing the effectiveness of specific tanks as compared to others. It's one thing to lose a tank when it will require a year and hundreds of millions of dollars to build a replacement, and another entirely when there's a serial production line churning them out or refurbishing them cheaply and quickly. As World War II demonstrated, the ability to mass produce and repair tanks makes a significant difference to their overall effectiveness. Nobody disputes that, by most measures, German Panzers were superior to Soviet T-34s and most other Allied tanks of the day. Roughly 4 Allied tanks were lost during the war for every German tank. But the Allied forces, particularly the Soviets and the US, outproduced the Germans by around 5-1. And ultimately, it was the inferior Soviet T-34s that rolled triumphantly into Berlin. Crew training, or the lack thereof, can also make all the difference. If a tank performs poorly because its crew has had insufficient time to master its use, you can't really point to deficiencies in the tank as the reason it keeps ending up as a smouldering hunk of metal on the battlefield. So, to sum it all up, to properly assess tank performance in a particular conflict, you need to combine real-world engagement analysis, i.e. kill ratios, losses, and involvement in successful missions, with a contextual evaluation of how they were used, whether they were effective in that role, how easy losses are to repair or replace, and ultimately whether the means justify the ends. Isolated technical comparisons like counting losses only tell a part of the story, which can be misleading. The problem when it comes to assessing MBT performance in Ukraine is that reliable hard data is pretty hard to come by. That's entirely understandable. As expected in the middle of a raging conflict, most information from the battlefront is either classified, obscured to a greater or lesser extent by the fog of war, or outright propaganda. Which is where the military show comes in, to cut through the noise and deliver cutting, insightful analysis. If you haven't done so yet, subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on the real story. Now, there are a number of detailed studies looking at the effectiveness of tanks and various other kinds of weapons from the world wars, with much of the hard data long since open to public and academic scrutiny. When the dusty black earth finally settles in eastern Ukraine, hopefully we'll have access to the same. For now, however, we don't really know anything meaningful about the actual kill ratios of the various tanks in action in Ukraine on either side. In some cases, based on the results, we can get a good sense of whether the missions they were involved in were successful or not. But we only really have anecdotal evidence to assess the other factors, like crew training, ease of maintenance, and repairability. From official reports, OSINT, and footage, we can glean a fair bit about the evolving ways in which tanks have been deployed, their vulnerabilities, and how those are being dealt with. But even when there's relatively hard data, such as numbers of damaged and destroyed tanks, they tend to be more liquid than solid. Still, this is the best we have to go by. So let's see what it tells us. The fact that Russia has suffered staggering losses of tanks and most other types of military equipment during the war is not in doubt. The only debate is the scale. As of February 2026, the General Staff of Ukraine's Armed Forces reported that Russia had lost 11,654 tanks and 24,013 armoured fighting vehicles since February 2022, a total of 35,667 armoured combat vehicles. However, independent website Oryx Spionkop, the most widely cited source of equipment losses in the Ukraine war, lists a total of 13,887 verified losses of Russian armoured combat vehicles, including 4,308 tanks. That roughly threefold difference between the two sets of numbers could be due to Oryx undercounting, the General Staff inflating the figures, or a combination of both. Certainly, Oryx methodology, which requires geolocated photo or video confirmation, means their figure is likely to be the lower bound. But 3 times lower? The discrepancy is even more pronounced with the numbers for Ukrainian losses. According to the Russian Ministry of Defense, as of February 2026, Ukraine had lost a total of 27,620 tanks and other armoured fighting vehicles, although it's unclear how many of those are tanks. Considering that Russia started the war with a much larger stockpile of tanks and other armour than Ukraine, that number would imply even more devastating losses for Ukraine than for Russia. However, Oryx has only verified a total of 5,596, 5 times less than the Russian MOD figure, of which 1,371 are tanks. The Russian website Lost Armor, which uses a similar visual confirmation methodology to Oryx, is remarkably close to Oryx, listing 1,378 lost Ukrainian tanks since February 2022. Now, Ukraine was estimated to have a maximum of 1,000 tanks in working order at the beginning of 2022, with as many as 1,500 more sitting in storage in various states of disrepair. These were mostly Ukrainian-modified Soviet-era T-64BVs, along with legacy T-72s and T-80s. Since the war began, Ukraine has also received at least 777 MBTs from its foreign partners. These include at least 130 German Leopard 2As, mostly the A4 variant, but including at least 18 of the newer, sturdier A6 variant, 10 Swedish Stridsvagn 122s, a modified Leopard 2, around 60 Polish PT-91 Twardys, a heavily modified T-72, 14 British Challengers 2s, 76 US-made but US and Australian-supplied M1A1 Abrams, 458 T-72s of various types, and 28 Slovenian M55s, an upgraded version of the vintage T-55. For its part, Russia was estimated to have around 3,300 active tanks when it invaded Ukraine, with roughly 2,478 in storage, many of which are in a state of disrepair. The active tanks were, and still are, predominantly modernized variants of Soviet-era T-72s, T-80s, and more modern T-90s, primarily the new T-72B3, T-80 BVM, and T-90M. Storage yards were stacked with older, rusting, unmodified versions of the T-72 and T-80, along with thousands of legacy models like T-62s, T-64s, and World War II-era T-54s and T-55s. Simple math tells you loads of those have been unexpectedly wrenched from their slumber or cannibalized since the war began. If Russia started the war with 3,300 active tanks, and has losses of 1,000 more than that, but still has enough left in action for Ukraine to be hitting them daily, the extra tanks have to come from somewhere. Repairs and newly produced units only cover a portion. So, out of storage, thousands of old tanks have rumbled, including some of the tracked vintage cars, joining the widest array of tanks assembled across battle lines in 80 years, at least until their turrets get blown off by Ukrainian drones. For many of these tanks, it's the first time they've seen real combat against a peer or near-peer rival. For all of them, it's the first time they've had to deal with intense 21st century warfare, with ubiquitous surveillance, networked communications, and the ever-present threat of unmanned death from the skies. So, how have they fared? It's fair to say that all these tanks, without exception, have failed in the traditional role of main battle tank. That is, none of them has succeeded at being the dominant force on a battlefield, the fulcrum around which maneuver warfare is conducted. That's because tanks don't rule the battlefield in Ukraine. Drones, and to a lesser extent artillery, do. In the early stages of the war, before drones had become such a dominant factor, Russia started its invasion in more or less the traditional way. Columns of tanks and armoured infantry carriers steamed forward under the cover of air power. It took half a year for Ukraine to stem the tide and launch a counter-offensive, reclaiming the territory it had lost in the Kharkiv region and the west bank of the Dnieper River in Kherson Oblast. However, by that stage, it had lost roughly 3/4 of Kherson and neighbouring Zaporizhia Oblast, along with additional large swathes of Donetsk and Luhansk, effectively putting Crimea out of reach. That initial foray, by far the most successful in terms of territory gain for Russia during the war, cost it well over 1,000 of its frontline tanks. Expensive, supposedly modernised tanks provide little match for old-school Soviet landmines, artillery, and shoulder-fired ATGMs, let alone drones. Based purely on that number, you could conclude that all three Russian frontline tank models are a write-off. But maybe, for Russia, the ends justified the means. Maybe, strategically, the loss of 1,000 plus tanks was worth those significant territorial gains. By the same token, the process of withstanding the initial Russian invasion cost Ukraine a roughly equivalent proportion of its total tank fleet, which at that stage didn't include any Western-supplied tanks. You could conclude that that's a disaster, since at the end of the day, Russia had large territorial gains to show for its losses. Then again, for Ukraine, maybe the loss of those tanks was ultimately a small price to pay to bring the advance to a halt. Without access to much deeper data on how the various tanks were used offensively and defensively, their kill ratios and individual battle outcomes, it's impossible to determine conclusively how effective either the Russian or Ukrainian tanks really were. Judging from the admittedly limited data on lost armor, which, unlike Oryx, list equipment losses by date, Ukraine also used its tanks to spearhead its Kharkiv counter-offensive. Like the Russians during their offensive, Ukrainian tanks seem to have suffered a higher rate of attrition attacking than defending, corroborating the data from World War II discussed earlier. But again, given the success of the campaign, it's an open question whether Ukraine considers those losses to be acceptable or evidence of the ineffectiveness of its stalwart homegrown and much exported T-64BV variant. The introduction of Western tanks, particularly the much heralded Leopard 2s and M1A1 Abrams, was considered by many to potentially be a game changer in the war. So superior were they to the Russian junk that they would spearhead a Ukrainian counter-offensive that would roll right over them and end up retaking Crimea, or so the theory went. The bubble burst in the minefields, anti-tank fortifications, and artillery and drone bombardments of the Surovikin line in southern Ukraine in 2023. The Ukrainian counter-offensive failed spectacularly, with mass Ukrainian armoured formations ultimately unable to even breach the first of 3 defensive lines. And Leopard and Abrams crews were forced to abandon their lustrous tanks in the mud. Then drones took over the battlefield, and tank warfare changed forever. It turns out that no matter how thick your armour is, how advanced your optics are, how well the hull absorbs recoil, or how accurate the gun, multi-million-dollar tanks are all vulnerable to cheap and nasty FPV drones. They're all easily spotted by ubiquitous surveillance drones that inform nearby FPV drone operators or artillery or loitering munition operators of their position and target them within minutes. Some tanks may take more hits to disable due to superior armour, but all of them proved wanting against this new class of threat. As a result, the answer to the question, which tanks are winning the war, is none. None of the tanks on either side has made a substantive difference to winning the war, or losing it for that matter. But the story doesn't end there. Tanks are evolving to meet the demands of the new battlefield, as is the way they're being used in Ukraine. And although they may not be as dominant a force as they once were, they can still be extremely effective in their new roles. For starters, pretty much every model of tank on either side these days only ever makes an appearance under layers of anti-drone protection. Initially, tank operators started attaching metallic contraptions to the top of their tanks to prevent FPV drones from dropping explosives onto them or attacking them kamikaze style from above. Initially mocked as cop cages, these attachments have not just become ubiquitous, but superseded by ever more expensive and grotesque-looking layers of drone defenses. Today, tanks in Ukraine look more like something from a Mad Max movie than the streamlined beast of old. Turrets peep out behind layers of wire mesh, mine trawls, and pieces of twisted metal welded at various angles to the roof and body of the tank. The idea is to cover up the exposed parts that drones target, and to force attacking drones to detonate further from the tank's armour, reducing the consequent damage. These modifications began as one-offs, being applied on a case-by-case basis in the field. However, by the end of 2025, Russia seems to be installing comprehensive so-called hedgehog armour on all its newly produced and refurbished T-90Ms, T-72B3s and T-80 BVMs. And Ukraine seems to have attached such armour to all of its Soviet-era and Western tanks. As a result, all tanks in use in Ukraine on both sides have become more survivable. As the relentless flow of footage of damaged and destroyed tanks on both sides attests, the hedgehog armour doesn't make them invulnerable. It just takes more hits to stop them, which makes even the antique T-54s and T-55s more effective. Given the dwindling tank numbers and increasing use of drones as the primary battlefield assault weapon, both Russia and Ukraine have also been using their remaining tanks more sparingly. The so-called meat waves, where large numbers of infantry backed by tanks would attempt to storm enemy positions in a full frontal assault, are largely a thing of the past. Instead, since the summer of 2025, both sides have been primarily using tactics of infiltration in small groups of infantrymen on foot, motorcycles or in pickup trucks backed by drones. Alternatively, assaults are conducted in smaller columns where tanks are used as battering rams to clear the path for infantry carriers to pass through behind them. Most of the tanks used in these assaults end up getting damaged or destroyed during the mission, but in many cases, the infantry is ultimately able to complete the mission and the damaged tanks are recovered and sent for repairs. If the mission fails and the tank is destroyed or even captured as a result, that would point to the tanks being ineffective. But if the mission succeeds, it's much less clear whether that is in fact the case. Without much more data about the success rates of these operations, it's impossible to tell. Both sides are also using tanks far more as fire support and in defensive roles rather than to lead assaults. Tanks are kept under cover just behind the front lines and used as a kind of high-accuracy self-propelled artillery to shoot at frontline and near-rear targets, provided by overhead surveillance drones. Obviously, the attrition rates of these defensively used tanks are much lower than for the tanks used in assaults. But again, without hard data on kill ratios, it's hard to gauge which models are more effective than others. Certainly, judging by statements made by Ukrainian operators, while Ukrainian Challenger 2s proved too few in number and too heavy for frontline assaults, they have been very effective in this fire support heavy sniper role. The low attrition rate, 12 verified hits out of 37 active tanks of the Polish Twardy tanks, suggests that it's probably been the most effective tank in both offensive and defensive roles out of everything on display. In general though, while the overall attrition rates of Ukraine's Western tanks are much lower than the attrition rates of Russia's tanks in total, it's impossible to tell definitively whether that's because the Western tanks are more survivable and/or effective, or have been used in ways that expose them to destruction less frequently. With all this in mind, you would think that tanks are likely to become less and less important in the future. On the Ukrainian side, increasing requests for air defense systems, artillery shells and unmanned equipment, and a decrease in requests for tanks suggest that this may be the case. For Russia, however, tanks seem to still be an important component, with production of new T-90s and refurbished older tanks increasing anywhere from 2- to 4-fold during the war. Indeed, as Bekan Ozdoyev, industrial director of the Rostec State Corporation Weapons Cluster, recently told state news agency TASS, the battles in Ukraine show that a tank is still indispensable in the right place at the right time. Leaked documents reveal that despite the seeming ineffectiveness of its various tank models, Russia plans to dramatically ramp up tank production over the coming decade, particularly of the T-90M. Russia already outpaces the entirety of NATO in tank production and refurbishment. Although next-generation Western tanks like the Challenger 3 and Abrams X entering production in the coming years may change that equation significantly. Looking at those staggering Russian tank loss numbers, it's hard to understand how this increased emphasis on tanks makes sense. It seems that, like beauty, tank effectiveness may ultimately be in the eye of the beholder. Now, hit that subscribe button to stay up to date with the latest in tank warfare and military news in general. Thanks for watching.